This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. I am in Napa, California today for this episode of the podcast, and sitting across from me in this small but bespoke built brew house designed specifically for lager brewing is Nick Gislason from Hanabi Lager Company. Welcome to the podcast, Nick.
Thank you so much, Jamie.
You've got a really interesting story coming out of the winemaking world, but your roots are on the farm in the Pacific Northwest. It's a fascinating story of even welding your own brew house here to make the lagers that you want to make. I can't wait to dig into that and kind of pick your brain for some of your approaches there. Before we do that, G&D Chillers, born in the Pacific Northwest from a lot of hard work and a singular goal. They've become the best damn chiller company in the world. Like you, G&D never settles. They're relentless and strive to be better every single day because they take pride in the work they do. They're craftsmen who know good enough just won't cut it. Visit G&D Chillers at CBC booth 3011 or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, meet the latest in the BSG Hop Solutions portfolio, Sativa. Strong expressions of stone fruit, floral, and resinous pine flavors and aromas define this blend, crafted specially for use in hazy IPAs and other hop-forward beers. Sativa is ideal for aroma, whirlpool, and dry hop additions to hazy and juicy IPAs or for any other hoppy styles where a combination of citrus, tropical fruit, and pine aromatics are desired. Go to bsgcraftbrewing.com to learn more or call 1-800-374-2739. So Nick, walk me through your history. And I don't just mean brewing history because I think you have an interesting agricultural country past that has fed into the kind of workmanlike approach that you take to these lagers, and not just to the beers themselves, but even the way that you make these lagers. And so, yeah, dig in a little bit to your own personal history.
All right. Well, so I was born up in the San Juan Islands in the Pacific Northwest and grew up on I guess you'd say, modern day homestead, for lack of a better term. It was 60 acres that we moved out onto when I was really very young, and nothing on it. It was just all forest, no house, no roads, no electricity, water, nothing. And so I spent most of the time growing up developing that property. We built a small cabin at first, and then building roads and doing some logging, building a shop, and then a proper house later on. And so I grew up always really being very hands-on, I guess you'd say.
Sure.
Everything from the excavating side and forestry and logging to growing family garden, raising animals, electrical, plumbing, farm welding, kind of the whole program.
The life that urban dwellers now seem to fetishize and pine after, but yeah.
It is funny, full circle. And so that was the beginning. And then, I got interested in fermentation also at a pretty young age, actually. It was just this, seemed like a magic almost in a way. So I had an uncle who was into home brewing since the 70s. And so he taught me to brew when I was, I don't even think I was 10, 11, 12 years old. I'd go over to his place and work with him and help him out. And so by the time I was about 14, I was really interested to start to brew myself. And so I did, and welded a small little 10-gallon brewing setup like so many people do with kegs that are converted,
sure.
and this kind of thing. And but I always just liked to brew for the community. In those days, my parents, we worked out a deal that, I was pretty young, and so they said, well, you can brew, but you have to give most of it to us and to your grandparents.
Smart.
And uncles and aunts and everybody else. And so that was just always a fun project where I would brew beer for like friends' weddings and different family events and work parties. It's a common thing up there, in a small community. A lot of like, barn raising was
Sure.
a thing, actually.
A real thing, right.
A real thing. You'd call a bunch of people and we'd tip up these big old walls that were too heavy for just a few. So would brew beer for things like that. And growing up, I'd say when I was a middle or late teenager, I thought that brewing was going to be kind of life's path at that point. So learned to weld in the middle of all that. Worked in a couple different metal shops in those days. And then went off to college and studied engineering and started to work in a brewery. So that was up in Bellingham, Washington, at Boundary Bay up there. And so cut the teeth there in that cellar and just totally loved it.
Yeah.
For obvious reasons, I think everybody probably listening knows all about. It's so much fun. And so did that while I was in Bellingham, but then I was really interested to get reacquainted with working outdoors and with agriculture. Growing up that way in the San Juans, it was just something ingrained in me that I needed to be working outdoors with my hands as well as indoors. I like the cellar work a lot in the brewery for sure, but I was trying to find a way to get reacquainted with agriculture.
Sure.
And so that's where wine came into the program. And growing up with the family excavation business, we helped develop San Juan Vineyards, which is on San Juan Island. And it was the first winery on the island. And so there was really no, like background knowledge. No one knew how to plant vineyards there. People knew a little bit about agriculture in general, but not so specifically with grapes. And so I worked with, there was a young French winemaker who they'd brought over from Champagne to develop this project. And he was young, he was in his 20s. I was a teenager at the time and got to work with him. And, he was instructing us how to prepare soil and how he wanted things prepped to get ready for the vines to go in. And then I saw that he had this really interesting lifestyle in terms of he was working in the vineyard side about half of his time and then working in the cellar the other half of the time. And I thought that seemed like a really interesting balance. And so I just filed that away. That's when I was a teenager. And then after college, visions of that kind of came flashing back and decided to pursue wine for a while just to see what that was all about. So I did a little bit of traveling, working in New Zealand and then back in the States, in Washington and down here in California, and just fell in love. It was this perfect blend of agriculture and actually getting to work with the raw materials, to grow the raw materials, and then see them all the way through into the cellar. And it was it just seemed like a great passion to pursue. So went headlong into that. But brewing's always been very near and dear to us.
Sure. So then you were working professionally in wine, ended up here in Napa. Talk to me about getting deeper and deeper into that professional wine world.
Yeah. So in Napa, I started out working in the mountains, so up on Howell Mountain, and love that. It's definitely, it's an interesting place to grow grapes because it's a little bit on the edge. Like, you're up out of the valley. The soils are really rocky. There's a lot of unique challenges growing grapes up in the mountains like that. But that was a lot of fun, and that definitely lit the spark. Went to New Zealand, worked there, decided that I needed to maybe study wine formally if I was going to go as far as we were hoping that we could in terms of pursuing quality and the craft. And so went back to school. So came back to the States and went to UC Davis over there and in the master's program and a graduate degree in winemaking and viticulture, and then came back to Napa and have more or less been here ever since. So working for a small producer in West Oakville called Harlan Estate at first, and then transitioned over to Screaming Eagle, which is where I'm at now, over in East Oakville, just across the valley. And I've been there 11 years now.
Yeah. You're now head winemaker for Screaming Eagle?
Yeah, since 2011. I worked with a great mentor of mine named Andy Erickson. He was the previous winemaker. And and I took over for his duties in 2011.
And Screaming Eagle makes some wine that a lot of people seem to like.
Oh, it's a great spot to grow grapes. I mean, the simple fact of it, it's just, I'd tasted a lot of wines from around Napa, and I wasn't necessarily married to stay here, actually.
Yeah.
As a Washington guy, was thinking to go back north and make wine up there, actually.
Sure.
In the Davis days. But then, once I tasted the wines from Screaming Eagle, and once I saw the vineyard and tasted the different components of the vineyard, that was the interesting part for me. It's a really diverse site for being only 40 acres, a tremendous diversity of components. And in general, it's just they represent the style of wine I love, which is they have complexity, but also a lot of freshness, a lot of energy.
Yeah. And for those that aren't familiar, I was deliberately understating it, but Screaming Eagle is one of the most consistently highest rated wineries in California, and continuously celebrated by those wine experts that love to celebrate great wine. And so it's an interesting one. You come out of that and have this successful career as a winemaker for an incredibly well-respected winery, and of course wouldn't need to do anything else. And then here we are sitting in your brewery side project, which is a completely different, or kind of, well, I shouldn't say completely different. It's definitely a complementary but also different kind of rhythm. I want to talk to you about how the inspiration behind this brew house again, and your approach to brewing and how you built it all. Before we do that, a brewery might have 99 problems, but your fruit supplier shouldn't be one. Old Orchard is already known for their quality concentrates, but they also pride themselves on consistent product and reliable supply. When brewers need assistance, Old Orchard is just an email, phone call, or even a text away. Based in Greater Grand Rapids, Michigan, better known as Beer City, USA, Old Orchard is core to the brewing community. To join their fruit family, learn more at www.oldorchard.com/brewers. Also, with nearly 20 years of innovation and experience, Brewmation specializes in electric, steam, and direct fire brewhouses, complete cellar solutions, and automated controls for the craft brewing industry. From half barrel to 30 barrel systems, Brewmation puts you in control to design a brewery that fits your needs and a brewing style. Whether you're starting a new brewery, upgrading your cellar, or just need some parts to keep you up and running, Brewmation has you covered. Visit them at brewmation.com to get started. So, Nick, again, you don't need to start a brewery. You have a successful career as a celebrated winemaker now, working for one of the top names in the California wine business. Why start a brewery?
Well, I guess I'm a glutton for punishment. But no, it's...
You have this beautiful rhythm where you can work part-time outside and part-time indoors, and go with the seasons. And now you're in an industrial facility inside, making beer, and while also still doing your primary job as a winemaker.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I've always been a builder, I guess. That's kind of the brass tacks of it. I like to be working on something all the time. It really is a passion. And it is really complementary, and that is the cool part about it, I think, from my perspective, is that what we can do here throughout the year really complements ideas that we can bring into harvest in the winery. It just keeps us, very fresh on fermentation and that rhythm, and then vice versa. Then every wine harvest gives us a lot of food for thought in just a different context, a different agricultural product that we're working with there, just grapes versus grain, and so then we in turn have a lot of ideas coming off harvest into the brewery again for the rest of the year that we can put into practice here. So it is like a push and pull. I feel like
Sure. Why focus this brewery on lagers? And we should say, like, you have built this entire brew house just to build lagers. That is your intention, to only brew lagers here. Yeah.
So lager, started out brewing ales. So in the Pacific Northwest, it was certainly, at least at the time, ale country for sure. So brewing strong, powerfully flavored ale styles. And then after getting into wine, I guess there was just a shift in my palate, I guess. My wife and I's palate. We do this project together, and we're both winemakers, and we just our palates gravitate towards wines that are at the same time very complex, but also fresh and vibrant. And so within brewing, it seemed like lager techniques, lager brewing is just a really excellent way to get after a style like that. I think there's potential for incredible complexity of flavor, depth of flavor, but at the same time in a architecture that's really fresh and vibrant and refreshing, leaves you feeling like very clean, very nice. And
it allows those small nuances of agricultural production to kind of shine through.
Absolutely. Yeah. To us, we gravitated towards lager brewing about 10, 11 years ago now. And, we've always been brewing all along after leaving it professionally. We always would brew for the winemaking community, just whoever we lived around, right? And
it takes a lot of beer to make great wine.
That's the truth of it. And so it was about 10, 11 years ago that we started to really hone in on just exclusively lager brewing. And it was just stylistically for those reasons. We felt like we could work with very special grains and then showcase them through the lens of lager. It just seemed like a neat way to parse out all the intricacy, the complexity of flavors, but in a profile that was really approachable for wide variety of people.
Sure.
And really fresh and clean and vibrant.
Yeah. For the folks that are listening, they can't see the brew house that we're sitting in right now, but describe your process, because you did literally weld a good chunk of this equipment, including the whole hot side of your brew house. You welded it yourself. That's not a story that we hear from a lot of brewers out there in the world today. But that's an interesting element to this, workman-like approach that you take to lagers, crafting each piece of the production puzzle so that it can make the exact beers that you want to make.
Yeah, it seemed like I don't know, to us it was just the natural way to do it, I guess you'd say.
For a kid who grew up on the country doing everything himself.
And so the project, there's some other people involved that I think are useful to know about as well,
Sure.
just to give context. And so since about 11 years ago, I got involved with JV Northwest up in Portland, Oregon, through winery projects down here, building wine tanks and winery stuff. And there was a fellow I met up there named Jared McClintock, and I didn't know him at the time. And he was fairly new to JV, but then very quickly moved into basically being their lead brewery designer and was there for about a decade doing that. And so I got to know him through the wine tank side of it. And then, of course, we got together and drank some wine and then started to talk about beer and brewing, and very quickly realized that we had a lot of common interests in terms of styles of beer that we like, in terms of just all the cool projects out there going on in brewing. And so we started to work together. And so I would come in and work on brewhouse designs with him for, I guess you'd say, the trickier situations, people who wanted to do things like decoction and things like that. And so we would get together and just rap about design, and we could go on. I mean, it'd be hours and hours and hours all night and about brewhouse design. And it was just a passion project for me, a side project, honestly. And I've always loved it, the process side of things. But so got to know Jared over the years, and then he would slowly start to come down and work on the pilot brewery with us. So before this brew house that we're sitting in today, we built a pilot it's basically a very similar rendition of this. It's a 5-vessel barrel and a half brew house that's just dialed in for decoction and lager, stuff like that. And so he would come down and we would brew on that system, and we'd be looking at these two cool different grains that we're working with, and a lot from the Pacific Northwest, as well as elsewhere around the world as well. And it was just a fun way for us to get together and just talk about beer and brewing and wine and where they intersect. And so that relationship developed, and he's heavily involved now in the brewery today. And then through that, there's another fellow named Trevor who works in the shop up there. He's one of the lead fabricators for brew houses, and he became a good friend over the years as well. And so the three of us would have work parties to build all this. And it was just that. It was a truest sense work party. We'd get up super early.
Raising the brewery barn. And
that was literally it. It would be just for the fun of it, get up at 4 a.m. and come in and start banging on metal and have at it until the sun goes down, and then eat well and drink well and do it again the next day. And it was just a righteous fun time over the last 5 or 6 years that the three of us have been kind of working on this and putting it all together.
It's a long process of production and build out to get here, but I guess you had the luxury of that just because it wasn't a full-time job and there wasn't that kind of pressure immediately to get up and running and start making something to pay off all the debt. Yeah,
exactly. It was, always has been a very grassroots project like that, slowly and surely, and building almost everything ourselves. And it was a fun way to work in a lot of ideas, like for Jared and I, working on all these different brew houses all over the place. There's always some kernel of wisdom that you come away with, right? Commission a brew house, go through everything and work with the brewer. And then there's always something like, next time we'd make this little tweak and this little tweak. And you're always honing in on brew house design. And this is certainly a reflection, what we're sitting in here, of, years of that and talking to so many people and working on so many different brew houses. And there's just a lot of little bits and pieces that have come together here through that process.
Let's talk through the actual brew house system and setup and what you've built. Obviously, again, people are listening, they can't see it, but talk about the kind of fundamental design and some of the decisions that you all made in order to, again, facilitate lager brewing through this system and really dial it in for that.
So starting, I guess, on the hot side, decoction has always been an important part of lager brewing for us, and as well as cereal mashing with potentially other grains than just barley. And so there's 3 mash kettles, and so that gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of how we're decocting and how long. And then also gives us there's a pragmatic component for throughput as well. When you're doing triple decocted lagers, these things take a long time. Yeah. So to have more mashing capacity is extremely useful for that. So 3 mash kettles, and then we transfer over to Lauderton. And the Lauderton has a big sight glass right in the front. And so we can see basically a full vertical cross section of the grain bed. And that was because we knew that we wanted to work with a wide variety of grains. And in terms of just barley, some new varieties, some very old heirloom varieties. I think that's been a particular passion for us, coming from like kind of agriculture background and grape growing and winemaking, is just a little geeky about finding varieties that maybe they don't have the best yield, maybe they're really hard to work with, but maybe the flavors are just particularly interesting. And And so we needed a very flexible brew house that would allow us to work with this wide diversity of grains. And to be able to see inside the Lauderton physically is really useful for that, because, these barleys and the other grains, they behave really differently. And with the way that we brew, we only do 4 special batches in a year. So it's 1 per season, basically every 3 months. We pick a new barley that's our particular favorite, and we've worked on it on the pilot system for between, say, 6 and 18 months, kind of honing in how we want to approach it. And then we finally bring it into the big brew house here. And it's, since we're always changing like that, the ability to see inside what we're working on is incredibly useful, so that we can be adapting as we go. It's not like we're developing a recipe and and getting to brew it over and over and hone these things in. We need to do it pretty quickly.
I mean, I imagine for any release, you're probably doing more than one batch, and because you've got some bigger tanks here, and so over the course of doing that, you can learn some things and adjust on the fly. What are some? I mean, I'm curious because looking at this, sight glass that seems to stretch the height of a potential grain bed inside there. What are some of the things that you've seen, noticed, or been able to kind of learn and understand by watching how that lautering is happening?
Well, I guess a couple things. First, to really understand the behavior of your teague. That's a big one because every barley different in terms of the teague that it throws, and especially depending how we choose to decoct it in terms of like the thickness and things like this. The teagues can have pretty different buoyancies, different behaviors. And to be able to just see where they are physically. Are they sitting up on top of the grain bed very nicely, or are they starting to migrate down inside? And so to be able to see that on the fly gives us a lot of ability to fine tune our raking, our pump speeds, things like this, to deal with grains that might be more or less tricky from, say, the teague standpoint would be one. And then another would be, I guess, evaluating the mill and the mill settings. And, a lot of these barleys we work with, they're not the standard, like nice plump kernel, modern varieties.
Sure.
Some of them are a lot more heterogeneous than that, or, maybe slimmer. And to be able to just see the integrity of those husks and how much that they're maintaining an open porosity or not is really useful to adjust the processing for that particular batch, but then also the mill settings for the following batches that are going to come after.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating to be able to get that granularity right. Most brewers are looking down at the top of their lauter, and it's not as much information as some people might like to have.
Sometimes the eyes are your best tool, the eyes and the nose. I feel like, still that's our most important tools in here. There's, of course, there's flow meters and all the various other tools, right?
Right.
Looking at temperature, but you can just learn so dang much with just your nose and just your eyes, there's a lot to that.
Sure. There's a fair amount of stainless steel piping in here, as well as, of course, hoses to connect everything to each other. From the brewing process out, are there any specific concerns with the way that you've designed your kettles in order to brew the lagers that you brew?
Well, one thing about triple decoction is that it takes so much time. And so we really wanted to not waste much time for things like transfers and cooling and things like that. So everything is relatively oversized, I guess you'd say. So it's a nominal 7-barrel brew house, and there's mostly 3-inch piping all over everything.
Right.
So when it's time to send it to the lauter tun, that transfer takes place in about 50 seconds. And because we have a long day of decocting ahead and behind us, and we need to, move on to the next step of the process. So everything's built to be relatively quick, very easy to kind of understand and keep organized with a complex process. Doing multiple decoctions in a day with multiple batches, just need to keep things really orderly and organized. And so hard piping was really useful for that. Cooling for sure, heat exchange to be able to knock down as cold as we want to, as quickly as we need to is really important. So giant heat exchangers always help.
Sure. Moving from the hot side to the cold side, you've got a blend of cylinder conical fermenters and some horizontal fermenters here, which it seems like you use in concert with each other. Talk to me a little bit about that. Certainly both of those things are used extensively by top lager brewers, depending on where they are. And everyone has very closely held, strongly felt opinions about how they ferment lagers, because it's such an important part of the piece.
Yeah, certainly. I think, it's really just mostly, I'd say, yeast and lees dependent for us. So like in white winemaking, just as an example, There's a lot of time and attention paid to lees and lees management for building things like texture in white wine, and especially Chardonnay as an example. And so just depending on the yeast strain, some strains we use, we're very happy with how they behave in upright tanks. And then other strains, we just feel like the lees expression is just better in horizontal tanks. So it just depends on, the strain, flocculation, how happy they are to hang out in the tank for extended periods of time, and what that's going to bring us in terms of texture and weight in the beer.
Cool. Let's talk a little bit about some of the individual expressions. And it's an interesting one because each one of the releases that you've had so far is a separate, distinct individual beer. And there's not a flagship to reference here because that's not the way that you approach beer. But I want to talk about ingredients, and I want to talk about some of the then again individual yeast, malt expressions in those beers. Before we do that, there's nothing easy about brewing beer. It's an intricate, time-consuming art. The last thing you need to face is a recall or contamination that can hurt your pride and your pocketbook. Clarion lubricants meet strict purity and performance standards to help you make your system 100% food safe. That's protection for your equipment and your beer. So make the switch to Clarion and ensure your system is running smooth and safe. Go to clarionlubricants.com to learn more. Like I was saying before, barley in particular, or grains, or as you mentioned, in fact, I should say, is a key component to this, where so many brewers are very focused on hops, even lager brewers focused on hop selection, noble hops, or even the specific origin of their noble hops on specific farms, in Germany or in America. That is not a big focus for you. You focused on your agricultural piece of focus is on grain, and you use lager as a canvas to kind of express that. Talk to me about some of the ways that you've been able to express these different origin grains in some of the lagers that you've made so far.
So yeah, for us, definitely the interest has been in grain, and is I think lager is a really good approach to showcase those flavors in a way. And it's been an exciting time, I think, in the grain world recently, just from the standpoint, you think 10 years ago, especially in North America here, there were not a lot of small grain farms and small malting companies that were able to handle these small batches. And so 10 years ago, that was just barely becoming a possibility, and certainly every day becoming more and more real and more feasible. And so for us, it's just been a lot of fun to get to work with people to both discover really old varieties, and then also some modern varieties that maybe have let's say less focus on big yields and disease resistance, and these factors, of course, they're really important, but so's flavor. So I think we're coming into a time when barley that's specifically selected for flavor above, or at least in concert with, things like yield and things like disease resistance is becoming more real. So just as an example, we work up in the Skagit Valley a lot. Skagit Valley Malting up there, we worked with them since basically their inception in the beginning. And so there's some cool varieties that they're growing and working with that we use with the Hanabi project here. And then also recently became acquainted with a grower in Eastern Washington over in Palouse County that's particularly focused on heirloom varieties. And so they're working with like thousands of years old barleys, some extremely cool stuff up there. Very small scale. There's not really much of it available. We're talking in the handful of tons right here and there. But for our project, that kind of stuff is perfect.
Sure.
If we can only get 2 tons, that's just fine. We can work with that.
I love the kind of creativity that's coming out of that Washington agricultural world. And we've certainly talked about that with, in a grain sense in Saison with the folks from Fair Isle and using purple Egyptian barleys and others. And we talked about it with Garden Path fermentation also on the podcast, Ron and Amber, again, using those because they're in the Skagit Valley and making their beer only with ingredients from that Skagit Valley, maybe some hops that don't come from there. But you're right, this beer making and the value added by making beer with these ingredients has enabled some of these agricultural producers who have a passion for these things that they love to grow, but might not have found a commercial market for it. It supports their kind of nerdy love of that agricultural piece. And it's such an interesting interplay to think about beer as this means of supporting this historical approach or, legacy grains, heirloom grains and whatnot, and creating a market for these things that otherwise might not have a viable commercial market to support their growth.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a really exciting time, I think, from that standpoint, because chefs and bakers have, for instance, been pretty interested in these unique varieties of wheat and spelt and other grains for the kitchen or for baking. But I feel like in beer, it's only just coming recently here, in the last 5 years, maybe 10, maybe more like 5. And it's, I think, just going to be more possible as we go along here. As the more that it's supported, the more that people are interested in these varieties, the more that these farmers can put those in the ground and bring back a lot of varieties that maybe their grandparents grew. Like in the case of, Eastern Washington, there's a lot of growers in the far east over there in Palouse County that, they grow commodity varieties because that's what keeps the lights on. But a lot of these guys have some old heirlooms that maybe their grandparents had been growing and handed down to them. And they still grow just a little bit, on the side, just for personal use, for fun. And they weren't, at least until very recently here, and maybe not even still, commercially viable grains. Just the yields are a lot lower.
Sure.
They're harder to work with. The combines, they don't like them as much. It's harder to harvest grain like that sometimes. But at the same time, the nutrition, the minerals, the flavor can be just incredible, like very rich for older grains like that.
And it's a travesty to lose some of these things. I've spent time in cider orchards, and they're facing the same thing that or apple orchards, that this consumer demand for red delicious apples that are bright and waxy and bold and red has led to there are so few baking apples, pie apples, and cider apples out there. But some of those growers have just kept doing it because they had a small cadre of consumers that wanted to make their pies with those tart apples, and they're ugly and funky. And they've kept on going. And now this market wants more and more of those. And thank goodness there was somebody keeping that kind of agricultural strain alive so that those things are now available to us. And in this kind of case, it's beautiful to see that these growers are maintaining some of those things just for the love of it. And it's now the balls in the brewers' courts to find a way to make some of them interesting and tell a story about them in order to again, help give them a bigger leg up on life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're just cool grains, from the agronomy standpoint. Older varieties, they've always been interesting to me because, they were developed in a time when we didn't have modern fertilizers. We didn't even necessarily have irrigation as more modern agronomy tools, right? And so a lot of these they're bred to be fairly hardy, and I feel like they have a demeanor that's kind of like that. Like they're, some of them rustic, I think, in a very interesting, pleasurable way, like very flavorful, full of character. They definitely have personality, if you know what I mean.
Right.
Like, it's interesting to work with those, and they are very different than a lot of the modern varieties.
There's certainly a cost involved. I'm sure your cost for some of this malt is 4 or 5 times what it might be for more industrial available malt. But when you're producing a product that people are willing to see that value in and pay for, you can make those economics work out. I would love to talk a little bit about some of the specific barley varieties that you've been working with and on why you find them kind of compelling. Walk through some of the individual beers and some of those, the ways that you've coaxed interesting flavors out of those grains.
Yeah, sure. So let's see. I think so. One variety that we're still working with on the pilot scale, we haven't done a Hanabi release with it, but when the very first sacks of Chevalier came into the country, this would have been 2013, 14, I think, somewhere there. That first pallet, we had some of that grain, and I think just a really interesting historic variety like that. And I
love that. I mean, even though the brewery only launched in 2020, there was that many years ago that you were still sourcing these things and working on these piloting projects.
Yeah, the pilot's been going for a while. We built that. It was around 2010, somewhere there. And just strictly designed around decoction lager brewing. And so it's been a platform just to work with these varieties when maybe all you could get was 2 bags, 100, 200, 300 pounds. And not something that you could do a commercial release even if you wanted to, but it was a chance to get an early peek at things like that and start to get to know them a little bit.
Sure. So Chevalier?
So Chevalier is one that's in the pipeline still. And then from up in Washington, there's a variety. It's not an old one, actually, but it's a newer variety, but it does have, we think, fairly compelling flavor and demeanor, and it's called Franson. And so it's grown on eastern Washington as well as western, originally just the west side, which is mostly what we're familiar with, it growing in those conditions. But that one's been really interesting, just a really cool, like hay kind of flavors, like quite rich body, but at the same time, very fresh. So we've used Franson quite a lot. We're in the process, I guess before the latest that we have in the tanks here, some European varieties as well, which are, they're not nearly so rare as some of these others. They're more widely available, but still, I guess you'd say relatively niche. So varieties like Barca would be an example. Sure. And, we use varieties like that, and very classic, very delicious European varieties. And, really the pool that we have to choose from right now, you can basically count the varieties on almost 2 hands, maybe 3 hands. There's really not that many individual varieties that that are grown and kept separate, and that we can brew specifically lager beer with. And so that number is growing by the day, which is why it's a pretty exciting time. But it is still a pretty small pool that we're pulling from. So anyhow, so Barca is another one. And then in the tank, actually, we have a variety that's, I would say, I'm still going back and forth with the grower, and I believe this statement to be true, that this is the oldest variety of brewing barley that's being grown commercially today. So it's about 7,000 years old. It's a Viking variety. They grew it around Nordic countries since a long time ago, for both food and for brewing beer. And then today, the only place that this variety, it's called Bere, B-E-R-E, is really grown commercially is up in Washington State and also in the Orkney Islands off the north of Scotland. Mm-hmm. And I first got interested in this variety about 5 or 6 years ago. And at the time, the only place in the world that it was being grown at really any scale other than like for seed bank purposes, like a couple of rows or, a square meter of area was in the Orkney Islands. And even there, only about 15 acres. So that was world supply of this really old variety. And there's a whole culture around it there. So it's a big deal, and, harvest festival every year. And it's like this really revered heirloom variety that they've held on to in the Orkney Islands there. And so there's a grower up in Washington that basically left the family farm when he was young. So 6th generation grain farm in the Palouse County. And, hard to make a living growing commodity grains at several 100-acre scale. It's just a tough road,
Sure.
And so he and his brother left to pursue other careers. And specifically, the brother went off to be a professor in grain and spent most of his career gathering heirlooms from around the world. And so traveling to Europe, to North Africa, all over the place, gathering heirloom wheat, barley, spelts, different things, and then bringing them back. And a lot of those ended up on the family farm. And so they're growing a wide variety of these cool old grains, and some of them are working and some of them aren't. And it's a process of discovery. And so bear, I first got interested, say 5-6 years ago. The only place to find it was Scotland. So figured, well, maybe someday in the distant future, we'll get a handful of seeds over here to get to one of our grower friends who can build that up. And in maybe 4 or 5 years, we'll have enough bear that we could actually brew a commercial beer with. And, that was like a distant idea at the time. And then only about 4 or 5 months ago, the idea kind of came back and bit us, and we just got hot on the hunt to try to at least get the process going, because it would take so much time. We knew no better time than now to get going on that for a variety like that. And so started to make some calls and found some seeds in a seed bank out in the Midwest. And so I gave them a call, and they said, "Oh yeah, we have a little bit of bear." And I, how much? "Oh, well, we have about 5 grams we could sell you." And okay, well, that is a start, like a teaspoon of seeds. And so then a couple of days later, called them back and just to talk a little more about it. And she said, you seem really interested in this variety. Why don't you call the grower that we actually got it from? And gave me a name and number for a fellow up on Salt Spring Island, of all places. And so it was just funny when she said that, because coming from the San Juan Islands, Salt Spring is just 20, 30 miles north of us up in the Canadian Gulfs. And oddly, the first place I ever got brewing ingredients from, as a 14-year-old, was up there sailing around with the folks and came back to the boat with an armload of barley and hops. What are you going to do with that? Oh, we're going to brew beer. So it was strange to be led back to that island in search of this bear grain. So called that guy and told him the story and looking for some bear. And he says, "Well, I have a little bit more. I could sell you maybe 50 or 100 grams, but who you really want to talk with is the guy I get it from. And he's on the other end of Salt Spring Island. And his name is Ghetto Yogi. You should call Ghetto Yogi.
Ghetto Yogi.
Ghetto Yogi. He's apparently been a big fan of bear for a while." So, all right, we'll get a hold of Ghetto Yogi. And
does he grow anything other than grain? Because with a name like that, it kind of sounds like it.
You never know. You never know.
Hey, passion is passion.
And so get a hold of him, and he says, "Well, yeah, I have a little bit more than that, but maybe a kilogram." And so that's still, we're incrementally building up here, right? And but even still, that's several years away from having enough to do a proper Hanabi brew here. And so that happened, and we were just planning how to get that barley down here across the border and into the hands of some growers so that we could build it up, which is a process in and of itself. It's fairly arduous. But we were ready to go down that path and pretty excited about it. And I stayed late at work one night up at the vineyard there, and I just had a hunch, and you just have a feeling that you should be doing something, and had a hunch I needed to be digging some more for this grain. And so I go cruising around out there on the internet this late evening, and I find this PDF file just floating around out in the ether. And it's talking about a heritage grain festival out in eastern Washington, and in these like very small towns, very remote areas. It's just not a lot of people out there. It's fairly remote in some of these areas, but there was a heritage grain festival out there, and it listed a whole bunch of different grains that people had grown and then given to some local bakers and brewers. And I think some of it was, like homebrew scale, very small scale.
Sure.
But on this flyer, sure enough, I see Bear, and it lists the name of the farmer who grew it. And I said, okay, so surely somebody in North America must be growing at least some appreciable quantity of this grain. And so immediately went down that rabbit hole and got a hold of the farmer. And he said, all right, we need to talk. He said, there's a lot of small circles that's going to be pretty fun to get into. And without, belaboring and going too deeply into that rabbit hole, because there's chapter 1 and then there's chapter 2. We can talk about chapter 1. Chapter 2, we'll have to wait until a future time, but a very exciting one. And so anyhow, we talk and he says, yeah, the Bear, we brought it over years ago and have been slowly building it up. And how much do you need for Hanabi release? I said, well, if we could do, a few tons or 2 tons, something there, that would be incredible. And he just says, I have it. He says, I have it out here in the barn, and it's yours. And so it was all of a sudden, within a very short period of time, we went from, considering 5 grams of seed and building up over 4 or 5 years or more, to all of a sudden being able to work with this really old grain. And a lot of my family background is Icelandic, and so I was particularly excited, I guess you'd say, to work with a heritage variety from that area. And so we immediately got that into the pilot brewery and have been just working really hard on that since, I guess it's been February now, once we first got some down here. And then actually the beer that's in the tanks right now that we're sitting next to is a upcoming release of that particular barley. So we're excited about that one. That'll be a cool beer.
How's it taste?
Well, we'll just have to give it a try.
Oh, from your sensory and your piloting,
It's the thing about that variety is that it's weighty. Like, it has a lot of weight. And the only thing I can compare it to, if you think about like white Burgundy Chardonnay, is the best comparison I can make, where you have this really solid mid palate. And if you could ascribe a color to it, it would be yellow. Like the nature of the flavors are kind of yellow in nature. Mm-hmm. And so it has very strong mid palate, these really like hay and also some earthy elements. But then it finishes very fresh and very crisp. And that's kind of the magic balance, and the best Chardonnays that we like, it's, that's what you're striving for, like weight and presence and density, intensity, but then finishing very clean and very fresh, very long.
There has to be a certain kind, there's a wonkiness to all of this, but then there's also a risk piece of it too, because you've spent years trying to hunt down this barley before you finally find it. Mm. And there's also a chance that it doesn't create beer that tastes the way that you want it to taste.
Absolutely. And, that's a real possibility. And, there's been some that have come and gone like that. And that's the nature of the beast. And that's what makes the project, I think, it keeps us pretty engaged and interested, is because they're not all wins for sure. And that's the role of that pilot brewery. And we're turning that thing all the time. So we do a Hanabi release here only once per season. So every 3 months, full scale batch. But then the pilot, that's turning all the time. There are, batch after batch after batch through the pilot. And we might work with something for between, say, 6 months and a year and a half, maybe more. And ultimately we sometimes decide, it's just not it. It's not going to work. It's not going to reflect the pleasure that we want out of these beers. Because at the end of the day, you have, I think, two ways to look at varieties like this. And I think it's true in the wine world as well as with grain and beer, is there's the academic approach, or are you pursuing pleasure? And for us, it's certainly the pleasure. The academics is fun on the backside, but at the end of the day, it's trying to brew beers with the most pleasure that we can possibly work out.
Pure hedonic approach. Yeah, no, that's it's kind of fascinating. How many pilot batches might you do before you lock in something for a full-scale Hanabi release?
Depends on the grain, but I'd say anywhere between, I guess I should say it depends how familiar or unfamiliar we are with the variety. If we've brewed other styles of beer with it for a lot of years, then maybe we do 2 renditions, let's say, of a lager for Hanabi here, if it's a grain that we already somewhat know and have experience with. If it's something brand new, then it could be anywhere between, I don't know, say 3 and 6. Really never beyond 6, because at that point we've either decided
it's either go or no go.
Yeah, it's going to work or it's not going to work. And so maybe the average is between, I don't know, 3 and 4, somewhere there.
Sure. No, that's interesting because, I mean, obviously with a quarterly release schedule and the idea that, well, you're only brewing, so rarely, it sounds on the surface as if, there's this piece of lager brewing where continuing to brew and iterate and improve is certainly a key component of that in the history and tradition of lager brewing. And you're doing that. It's not happening at the release level. It's happening on that kind of earlier stage pilot level where that work is going in and that dialing in happens. It's interesting from our, to hear it that way. And understand that, yes, that background is being done.
Yeah. And that's always been a fun part of this project is, the history of working through these interesting varieties. So we get, when it's time to brew those pilot batches, we get together a little work party of winemakers, and it's fun because it's a group of people that they love beer. They're not brewers, but they want to learn more about it, and so it's fun to get a group together like that and be looking at grain instead of grapes with really similar techniques at the end of the day. Winemaking and brewing, it's in some ways different, but in a lot of ways not, honestly. And there's a lot of similarities. And so over the years, those pilot batches have been just groups of winemakers, and a lot of them often international. So Napa is a place where a lot of people come from around the world in wine to come and learn what's going on here. And so there's people from every wine region of the world. There's South Africans, French, Italian, Spanish, New Zealand, just literally everywhere. And we get to know these people. There's, in the wine world, this component of traveling early in everybody's career. It's called a stage, right? Or internships, but they're a lot more than that. It's usually professional winemakers that they've studied and have graduate degrees in winemaking, and some say several years, 5 years experience. And then you go travel and just to pick up different techniques, learn different ways of doing things. And Napa's particularly a hub for travel like that. A lot of people come here. And so with these pilot brews, it's often the fairly international group, people coming from all over and bringing, like stylistic input or commentary on these grains. And that's always pretty interesting, I think, to cross compare in terms of like when we're talking about palate and we're talking about structure of beer, the phenolics, the protein, the colloidal aspects of the structure. Certainly there's a lot of input from the winemakers, which is just fun to.
Oh, yeah. So you just focus group your lagers on, top winemakers that are traveling to Napa. Sure. Oh, okay.
All in good fun.
I'm sure everyone benefits from that, including those winemakers. For brewers out there who aren't winemakers, who want to employ or develop those kinds of that skill and breadth to what they do. What kind of learning and development would you suggest for them to build that broader palette of being able to approach brewing from a winemaker perspective?
Oh, I don't know. It's just one of those things. I think, I've always been a generalist. That's kind of the way I think about all this stuff, honestly. And what brought me into winemaking was a pretty generalist background. And just like all the nuts and bolts of making wine. It's just generalized kind of farm skills, right? How to build things, how to use eyes and ears, and then it's kind of combining this technical with the artistic, right? Brewing, winemaking, cooking. It's all any art form is the same combination. Music is the same way. This combination of technical knowledge and skill, but with the creative and the artistic as well. And so, I don't know that winemakers have anything in particular, to offer other than it's just we work with a different agricultural medium. That's all. And, when I was first learning to become a brewer, I was reading a lot of wine literature to cross-pollinate. And then vice versa, when I was becoming a winemaker, reading a lot of brewing literature. And I think there's a lot of knowledge and experience that can go that direction. And so, I think to me, it's just a matter of reading broadly and talking to people broadly, and definitely outside of the core field. At least for me, I find that always very inspiring, I guess you'd say. I'm talking with a brewer and I'll have ideas like, oh, that's something that we could use in the winery. And then vice versa, talking with winemakers, that's a kernel of something that we could maybe try out in the brewing world. And then same thing with chefs, they're doing, and bakers. There's bits of knowledge there that I think are really cross-compatible. So I think that's all. It's not like there's anything, magic about winemaking. It's like there's no secrets. It's just a different agricultural material, and some of the principles that are true with grapes are also true with grain, and vice versa. So I think that's really all.
Sure. No, I think being engaged on that broader subject of fermentation, ingredients, agriculture, and across all of these expressions that it takes in terms of pleasurable products, from beverages to baked goods to everything else, helps, and being consciously engaged as you're tasting and enjoying these things, and being able to articulate what makes those interesting or compelling. And, it's part of that constant process that we're all engaged in, or should be engaged in, if we are making things that hope or ascribe to that similar level of, pleasure, sophistication, a compelling nature that we're going to create for people. But I digress. What's the big picture kind of goal for Hanabi? Clearly you've got your primary employment as, winemaking, and Hanabi is this passion project that you all are maintaining on the side. How do you see this going, and how do you see those things working, in the next few years?
Well, I think the intention is that we always want to keep this project small enough that it's our own hands turning all the valves, directing grain, milling grain. Like, we want to be extremely hands-on forever with it. And so that's going to definitely limit the size. And it's just, as a builder, that's just where my passion is in all this, is that, is it a business? Yeah, of course. But my passion in it is to work with special grain and to brew things that are compelling. And for us, that's a hands-on process here. So it's always going to be small. It's always going to be a pretty grassroots little project here. And just a forum to get us together with other brewers and winemakers and just explore the craft. It's really all about that. That's it. It's an exploration in a way. It really is. It's working our way through grains that some of them we know and we're introduced to, and then some we don't even know what's coming. There's some varieties that we haven't met yet that I think will be pretty exciting coming down the track. We'll be here ready for them.
The most fun part of my job is talking to people that are incredibly passionate about what they do, and that can wonk out on those pieces. And it's been fun to talk to you about getting wonky on these things. I appreciate the time that you spent with me. G&D Chiller's goal is to be the best damn chiller company in the world. Sativa from BSG Hop Solutions captures citrus, pine, and tropical fruit notes. Old Orchard prides themselves on reliable product and consistent supply. Brewmation puts you in control to design a brewery that fits your need and make your system 100% food safe with Clarion lubricants. If you'd like to support this podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button, If you're a pro brewer or even if you're a consumer, check out our all access subscriptions that combine the magazines along with online content, like the classes that we've been filming this week out here in California with amazing breweries like Firestone Walker, Russian River, and more. Some really exciting stuff coming down the pipeline through that all access approach. Nick, if people want to learn more about Hanabi Lager Company, where do they find you guys?
Well, we have a small website, hanabilager.com, and so there's some information there. There's an email that comes directly to my wife and I, so you can reach us there, and we're always happy to chat about really anything at all brewing related. It's a passion.
Well, thanks for talking with me today. Cheers.
Thank you so much. Cheers, Jamie.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.